We end our August discovery of African urban legends this week. In the first episode, we heard the story of the showdown between Nyaminyami, the beloved and fearsome spirit of the Zambezi River, and the engineers building the Kariba Dam. In the second episode, we talked about the case of Epasa Moto, the territorial mountain god of Cameroon's Bakweri people, and the annual Mount Cameroon Race of Hope. That race brings people from all over the world to compete over who can run to the peak of the mountain, Mount Fako that is, and back the fastest. Seeing as Mount Fako is Epasa Moto's home, there are no shortage of legends about how he really feels about the race. In that episode, we also broached the topic of why urban legends, especially those which derive from folklore, come to be. We also talk about the impact of their existence, for better and worse. In the third and final episode, which is tonight, we will revisit this theme of how urban legends based on oral traditions come to be and their impact with a focus on trees. Hello, friends, and welcome to the Mythological Africans podcast, where we read and talk about stories from African mythology and folklore. I am your host, Helen Tunde. I'll start by saying I'm dubbing this episode the yapping episode because it's going to be a very short and very light-hearted general commentary on the topic. I'm still recovering from a 2-week-long family vacation, and so I've not had time to dig deeper or even develop a formal script for it. For those who don't know, when I do episodes, I will script them out. I will get my thoughts better organized, and tonight I'm freestyling a little bit. So if it sounds different from what you're used to, that is the reason why. But I wanted us to close the month of August with at least one more conversation on the topic of urban legends, because this is something that I spend quite a bit of time thinking about as I consider how oral traditions move across time. So we know that back in the day, people used folk tales and proverbs and riddles and all these methods to communicate with each other, to preserve information, and that has changed. That's no longer the case. Across most of the African continent, there are schools and other institutions that facilitate learning, and these traditional ways of learning are no longer the primary way in which people gather information and process information. But that doesn't mean people are no longer telling stories or are no longer engaging with their world, following the patterns established by oral traditions. As I always say, if you go to a regular African market or a bus park, you will hear jokes, you will hear stories, you will hear all kinds of things, and these are traditions in the making. The difference now is that they are an amalgamation of ideas and values and storytelling styles that come from different parts of the country. So in a regular African urban center, for example, you will not have just one people's traditional stories in play. You will have these stories from all over the region or all over the country, encountering each other and encountering modern technology. And that is how urban legends are born. As we talked about before, usually the context of this is when something mysterious happens and people are pulling on what they know and how they know how to tell stories to explain these mysterious happenings. If you are on the African side of X, or Twitter, if you still call it that, you might have come across the post from Ghana where a tree was cut and just massive quantities of water was pouring out of this tree. And part of the commentary was that the people believe that this is a special and sacred tree. It's a couple hundred years old. And of course, you had in the comments people explaining that, well, this tree is one of the kind of trees that will store water. I believe this is a kapok tree, or Ceiba pentandra. And this is one of the species of trees on the African continent, like the baobab, that will store massive quantities of water in its trunk. And they grow to be quite huge. These are massive, massive trees. And so something that came to my mind as I watched that video is that at a time when it wasn't clearly understood why these trees would store water the way they do, this was a prime example of a phenomenon, a natural phenomenon that will trigger all kinds of stories. And that essentially is how traditional folklore emerges. You have a landform that is big, is imposing, it's oddly shaped, it has unusual activity like a volcano or a plain that floods, rising tides, things like that, something enough to trigger people's curiosity or affect their lives. And a story will emerge around this phenomenon to explain it, to provide people with information on how to deal with it, how to navigate it. And so what then happens is that these stories last through time, but then urbanization happens, globalization happens, industrialization happens, and the stories that emerge around these natural phenomena kind of escape the limits of the peoples out of which they emerge. They encounter global culture, they encounter ideas from other parts of the world, and they emerge as urban legends. So you will have almost coexisting, the scientific explanation for what's going on, and then you will have what stories people tell about them. And so we have a couple of trees, I imagine, on the African continent that would fit into this category. Now, what's interesting is if you're in more rural areas, the sight of a big imposing tree deep in the forest is not really anything to write home about. What I believe happens is that if these landforms are more in urban areas, then the tendency for different stories about them to emerge is what is more likely in that context, because it's different people coming with their own ideas and all of these coming together to come up with a new story. So some people might take issue with the stories that form, but personally, I enjoy a good story. As long as it's not, one that pushes a fear-based narrative, especially one of those where there's almost always somebody who says they have a solution for how to make people not feel the anxiety or the apprehension they might feel about it, and then you have to pay them. Like those kinds of stories I take issue with. But I think it's important that people continue to tell stories about the phenomena that they encounter in the course of their lives, even if there is an understanding of what is really going on. Because first, it's a natural human impulse to want to memorialize things in story and song and dance and art. Even more, it's a quintessentially African thing. I mean, I don't feel like I need to explain this any further than even just saying that stories and the different ways in which we express ourselves, it gives us, our imagination, a chance to work on something other than the drudgeries of life. It's natural, it's human, and so we shouldn't stifle it, even though we might want to temper it with, like I said, not fear-based narratives. And it's a relatively harmless way to engage the environment and can help people remember key facts. People of old knew exactly which trees they could cut open for water in times of drought, based on the folktales and incantations and riddles and proverbs and all the oral traditions about them. And there's no reason why we might not employ these methods. Maybe not to cut trees open for water in times of drought. We have different mechanisms for that in urban parts of the African continent at least. But just to know what's going on around you, there's no reason why we couldn't use stories to further this along. But also, stories are a safe place to store curiosity for later exploration. It is a fact that across time, people have looked at the science of certain trees, animals, geographical landforms, and other aspects of the natural world with the myths and folktales about them as a starting point. In many cases, the folktales or myths were essential to a better understanding of the topic, and one example I can think about here is the case of the Virunga volcanoes in the DRC, where the folktale tells about how one brother chased the other brother across the different mountain ranges, and this basically documents how the flow of lava over time has resulted in different eruptions. And I think even Mount Pele in Hawaii has a similar story about, a volcanic deity going from one peak to another. And so, like I said, this is just an episode where I'm freestyling, I'm thinking through things as I talk. And my reaction to that video, was of course, what's going on here? And then seeing it, understanding that, okay, this is one of those trees that store water. But then reading the comments on there and, sitting with the tension of people saying, oh, we don't need to make superstitions out of everything, and people wailing about why the tree was being cut down in the first place, which I can understand that. This is normal. These are things that happen, and I hope that somewhere out there is someone who is taking a closer look at such trees and perhaps is being inspired in some way to think about how to perhaps conserve them better. I'm sure there's lots and lots of work that has been done on this, but that one video might have triggered curiosity in a way that would come up with something refreshing, a different way to approach things. Because the truth is, many of the iconic trees from the African continent have died or are endangered because of the way the relationship that we have developed with them. If it's a tourist attraction, then if it's not properly maintained, that poses a threat to the tree. If it's a sacred site, similarly, we talked about this with the Nakaima tree back in March. So these trees are cultural artifacts. They're iconic, they're important, but they deserve to be treated carefully, and the understanding the science, but also a story that gives us a different relationship with them might just be the pathway towards this. And so I'm going to stop here for the night. It's a short episode, but I've really enjoyed this examination of urban legends. It's definitely something I'm going to revisit. The thing is, I have struggled to find, documented sources that look at some of these stories as urban legends. And so I sometimes will hesitate to classify certain things as urban legends because they are still close enough to the cultures out of which they emerge that they are living traditions in a manner of speaking. And my aim with Mythological Africans, as I always say, is to open up a conversation, to get you thinking, to get you interested in researching. That's why I put so many resources in the episode notes. And this has been fun. I have an idea of where I want us to go for the month of September. If you remember, this year was supposed to be a focus on folklore as it intersects with geography, as it intersects with history, and as it intersects with psychology. And we've done a fair amount of geography, we've done a decent amount of history, but not so much psychology. We started edging in that direction in the last couple of episodes, and I think maybe I'll turn more fully towards that for the next couple of episodes. I know exactly where I want to start with this, and we're going to start in Cameroon, but you will just have to wait to hear about it next week. So thank you all, as always, for listening, and I will see you next week.